Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss how something is likely to show us how poorly protected we are as a country from a rogue and corrupt government. If the House of Lords deals with the Rwanda Safety Bill as expected this week, it will show that we are not a country of laws. The government are seeking to break our own laws as well as international laws that we are signed up to. Now, what is the check against this abuse of executive power? It's supposed to be the courts. But what if the government passes a law which says the courts cannot hold a government to the standard of law? It is the legislature which is supposed to be the check against this executive abuse. But what if the legislature is unable to do that? If this week pans out as expected by most journalists, this is what we're faced with. A country that cannot stop the government breaking the law. Other countries have faced this situation in the past. It has never worked out well for them without massive reforms. But there's a good chance that the House of Lords is going to do something this week which even politically interested members of the public will misconstrue. And if people are jumping to the wrong conclusion about a parliamentary process, then maybe that parliamentary process is too opaque and needs changing to be in line with at least the informed public expectations. Because this week may actually strengthen Keir Starmer's case for completely reforming, in fact, never mind reforming, replacing, the House of Lords, something which is resisted even within the Labour Party. So first of all, what problem is the Rwanda Safety Bill throwing up? We could, of course, discuss the highly immoral nature of the Rwanda plan in general. Consider that when Conservative MPs were voting to junk the second round of Lord's amendments last night, they removed one which was designed to protect the victims of slavery. The Conservatives, who often like to wrap themselves in the Union flag and talk misty-eyed about the days of empire, the British Empire was all right after it made slavery illegal, you know. It was actually not all bad. They've already passed legislation in the last few years which increases the risk of slavery in the UK and reduces the chance of detection where it occurs. And now, last night, they junked an amendment to a piece of their legislation which specifically tackles modern slavery. And it was the amendment that was defeated by the largest margin. So the Tories so hated the idea of protecting victims of slavery. That was the one they voted most overwhelmingly to junk. And this amendment didn't do anything else. It just protected victims of slavery. And the Tories said, no, we quite like slavery, you know. But anyway, this is not about the morals of the legislation. It's about the Constitution. What is immoral to one person is moral to another. There's an element of subjectivity about morality, right? However, the Rwanda Safety Bill seeks to allow the government to force the UK to break its own laws and international laws and prevent the courts from being involved in the process. Now, this is not something which can be fixed later. Doesn't matter that Labour have said they'll repeal this legislation in government. There are some bad bits of legislation which, if you repeal them quite quickly, you can potentially reduce the damage. Now, if this passes, it's going to be used. And if it's used in the way Sunak claims he intends to use it, then the UK will be in breach of international laws in such a major way that we will completely lose our moral authority to deal with abuses of power around the world. It won't matter if we change the government who broke that law. The UK, remember, when you look at another country, do you see that other country's government? Unless you're really, really interested in politics. No, you don't. You just see what that country does. And it's the same for us. People outside of the UK, they don't see a Conservative government or a particular flavour of Conservative government or the difference between a Conservative and a Labour government. They just see the UK. The UK will have shattered its soft power when persuading other governments that they can tackle genuine problems. Oh, you've got these problems? Yeah, you can deal with those within the framework of international law. We do, you can as well. Well, we will show that we can. And all of this because we do not have appropriate checks and balances in place to deal with a rogue, corrupt executive. And that is because the executive is formed from the majority of the elected part of the legislature. There's no bulwark against a single political party, even one without majority public approval, deciding to do the opposite of what it promised to do when it was elected and trashing our international reputation. Because remember, the Rwanda plan is in direct contradiction to a manifesto promise. It's not just that it wasn't in the manifesto, it specifically contradicts a manifesto promise from the Tories. Because the biggest problem with the Rwanda Safety Bill is not the immorality, it's that it exposes the fact there is nothing to protect our laws and constitution from a corrupt government. The House of Lords, in theory, could, but they won't, because that's not how they work. And it's not because they don't care about the issues. It's because they're not really supposed to protect our constitution. It's not their job. The entire parliamentary system is based on the notion that no significant portion of Parliament would deliberately ignore our own laws or damage our constitution on a large scale. It works on what's known as the good chap theory, but there are no good chaps. So what could be done differently? Well, Keir Starmer wants to replace the House of Lords completely with an elected chamber representing the regions of the UK and specifically tasked with protecting our constitution from the government. Part of the problem with the House of Lords now is a disproportionate number of the members live in London. They're not distributed around the country in the same way as the general population. Some don't even live in the UK at all. But also, because they're unelected, they defer to the elected chamber. The Lords are expected to offer up one more objection to the bill this week. They've had 2 rounds of amendments. Basically, what the Lords have tried to do is they've tried to say to the House of Commons, look, this legislation of yours, how do we explain it really simply? It's illegal. It's really bad for the country. Here is a way to change it so it'll be fine, right? And then the government rejected it, or rather the House of Commons rejected it at the orders of the government. So then the Lords have tried again. They've got, look, okay, you didn't like those amendments. Okay, we'll try something. We'll try and explain it a different way. It's a bit like me as a teacher. You explain things 3 different ways if you can, because some people will get it with one explanation, some people with another. So you try again. And then they've junked all those. They go, okay, you're still not getting it. So now what the Lords will do, they'll probably try one more time this week. They'll get the crayons out now. They'll look, right, let's make it really simple. Bad. Illegal. And then the Commons will vote it down again. And then, now, and then that'll be it. They'll just go, look, well, we're a revising chamber. That's all we do. You don't want the revisions. Okay. On your head be it, son. There are those arguing that the Lords should stand firm on this because it is going to be so damaging to us. I'm one of them, but I also understand that's not really what the Lords does. They are there to raise issues, not ultimately block the elected chamber. So as much as I would like to think they're going to say, no, we can't let this through, I think they're going to run out of road this week. Certainly journalists are behaving as if they will. The Lords will have made their points that it's unsuitable, but because the Commons is elected and they are not, they will drop their objections. Members of the public, including those who take an interest in politics, will not understand why. It is because their understanding of how our system works is not in line with how it actually does work. So we should change it to a system that makes sense, at least to reasonably informed people. There will always be people who don't like politics and they don't want to learn about politics, and it will always be a mystery to them. But I mean, to people who want to understand politics, make it make sense. Otherwise, you just increase the level of mistrust in politics if the system's not doing what you think it should. But it is not as simple as just replacing the Lords with an elected assembly, because that sounds like it deal with the problem. Well, then they're elected, so they get to block it. But that actually just creates a bigger problem. Because for a start, let's say at some point in the future, let's say the Tories had control of both chambers, the House of Commons and this new chamber, given that they'd both be elected, that would be possible. So they could then drive anything through. They could shatter democracy itself easily. And then let's say, potentially a more likely situation, let's say you've got one party in control of one house and another party or a coalition of parties in charge of the other, and they're very different and have got very different attitudes. Well, then you get standoffs because they'll be waging party political war against one each other, blocking even good legislation, as often happens in some other countries that have this. That's no good either. That's not a check against executive abuse. That's just party politicking. And that is a major fear of those opposed to abolishing the Lords. But there is a way to maintain what's called the primacy of the Commons, the idea that the second chamber doesn't block what the House of Commons wants to do. So I would talk about two reforms. One of them is sort of hinted by Starmer anyway. So, I mean, in theory, these reforms could be introduced to the House of Lords and you keep the House of Lords, but it would work way better with an elected chamber. So the first would be to have a process set in stone, not a convention, an actual set in law process where the House of Lords or alternative chamber amends legislation 3 times, as they're doing anyway. That tends to be the convention anyway. So if they think there's something fundamentally wrong with a bill, they have 3 opportunities to persuade the Commons of the error of their ways. After that, if the Commons rejects the revisions, the legislation passes automatically. Now, this has 2 advantages. First, it means the second chamber cannot block any legislation, even if they're elected. Second, because they've spelled out very clearly what the problems were as they saw it, if the Commons insists on doing things their way and it all goes tits up later, they cannot claim they were not warned, so they'll have to take responsibility. This reform would preserve the primacy of the House of Commons. It would mean that even an elected second chamber cannot block legislation for party political purposes. Worst it could do is like hold it up a bit to do the 3 revisions. But the second reform is crucial, and indeed an interpretation of Starmer's plans. Anyway, it may be me, I'm maybe extending it a little bit. So let's say the second chamber believes, it's tried to revise, like with the Rwanda Bill, for example, it's gone, look, you know, this isn't very good. And the Commons have gone, no, we like it. So let's say the second chamber believes that the legislation is not simply bad, but actually contrary to domestic or international law. So then what they can do is refer it to the Supreme Court. Now that's part of Starmer's plan. If the Supreme Court says, yeah, this legislation would breach our legal obligations, domestically or internationally, or both, as in the case with the Rwanda Bill, then the second chamber will have the authority to strike the legislation down. And that way you'd have to have 2 separate branches of the government agreeing that the legislation should not pass. The judiciary and 1 chamber of the legislature. And it would only be able to strike it down on very narrow and specific grounds, you know, to stop any party politic in here. You know, so you've got the Supreme Court there, so they're the legal experts, and you've got the second chamber in Parliament, which is, and if it, again, this is why it would work better if it was elected rather than the House of Lords, because if it's elected, it's hard to argue with. If it wasn't, if you just reform the House of Lords like this, you'd still have Tories in this situation going, oh, these unelected Lords blocking is absolutely disgraceful. So it's like, no, they're elected, mate. So you make the second chamber elected, you shoot that argument down. That is what I would do. It would mean that we'd have a more robust system against obvious abuses by a corrupt executive, because the executive would be completely separate from this second chamber. It's not in place right now, of course, so nothing, it can't possibly save our international reputation if Sunak gets his way this week. But if we are going to try and rebuild our reputation for the future, and countries that have fallen very far have rebuilt their reputations when they've done it right, we are going to need to fix our own roof first. So I would say that regardless of what happens this week, the argument for replacing the Lords becomes stronger. But if the Lords is unable to prevent the government from bypassing the courts as it breaks the law, then that argument surely becomes overwhelming. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching. Until next time, I'll see you later.